Iranian military scientist Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was assassinated near Tehran. Who are the actors or state actors with the means and the motives necessary to carry out such a terrorist attack? Let's take a look at what we know so far and examine the facts. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communiqué. Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was a prominent nuclear scientist in Iran. He was a brigadier general in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, also the deputy defense minister, and he headed the Organization for Defense Innovation and Research. On November 27th, he was assassinated in Absard, east of Tehran. The attack involved a hail of machine gun bullets. The injuries were too grave for him to recover from, and he died shortly thereafter in hospital. The attack received widespread condemnation in Iran, and Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, said the following: "Terrorists murdered an eminent Iranian scientist today. This cowardice, with serious indications of Israeli role, shows desperate warmongering of perpetrators. Iran calls on the international community, and especially the European Union, to end their shameful double standards and condemn this act of terror." After all, it's not unreasonable to assume that Israel had a hand in this. There are very few countries who not only possess the motives, but the capabilities and the means necessary to carry out such attacks. The indications of the role and motive are not that hard to see. The New York Times published an article saying that one American official, along with two other intelligence officials, said that Israel was behind the attack on the scientist. CNN also reported that a senior U.S. administration official said Israel was behind the assassination. While they don't give details about whether the U.S. had prior knowledge about this attack, after such assassinations, Israel's official policy is to neither confirm nor deny. However, let's take a look at what we do know. We know that Israel has for a long time opposed the Iran nuclear deal and accused Iran of having a covert nuclear weapons program. As a matter of fact, in 2018, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu named Dr. Fakhrizadeh personally in a presentation. He said, "Remember that name," as if he were issuing some sort of veiled threat.
This is how Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, head of Project Ahmad, put it. Remember that name, Fakhrizadeh.
We also know for a fact that the Israeli intelligence services, the Mossad, have had a targeted assassination program for a long time. In the Mossad, they have the Caesarea unit, which deploys agents in foreign countries, giving them deep covers for extended periods of time. And within the Caesarea unit, they have the Kidon, which carries out such targeted assassinations. Between 2010 and 2012, at least 4 nuclear scientists were assassinated in Iran by the Mossad. Even going all the way back to the 60s, Israel was assassinating German scientists in Egypt who are working on Egypt's ballistic missile program. So this is well within their capabilities and very typical of their MO. We also know that the United States, in a brazen act of terrorism, assassinated General Qasem Soleimani earlier this year. Israel and the United States partnered together to work on the Stuxnet virus to try and sabotage Iran's nuclear centrifuges. Also during the same period when they carried out these assassinations between 2010 and 2012. Earlier this year, we also had another act of sabotage at this same facility. So there's been a clear concerted effort here by the US and Israel to kill, to assassinate, to terrorize members of Iran's military establishment and energy sector. This is not a secret. Despite Israel's claims that Iran has a secret nuclear weapons program, there's no proof of this. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, has never substantiated that claim and has had unprecedented access to Iran's nuclear sites that no other country has given the agency. So what could the possible motives be behind this attack, other than political, perhaps? To find out more, I'm joined by Sayyid Mohammad Marandi, who is a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Thank you for joining me, Professor.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for having me.
Professor, we're hearing various opinions that this assassination to sabotage the incoming Biden administration from re-entering the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. And we're also hearing another opinion that perhaps this was meant to provoke Iran into an all-out conflict or confrontation so that Israel could directly strike within Iran. What are your thoughts on these ideas?
I don't really think an all-out war is a realistic scenario. Iran is too powerful, and it has too many powerful allies across the region. And the United States has been weakened over the past few years. This is not the United States of September 11, 2001. It's a completely different world, and the United States is a very different country. I think that it may be an attempt to sabotage Biden's own attempts to become the anti-Trump, although I'm highly skeptical that Biden will ever fully implement the nuclear deal. Obama never did, so I don't see how Biden would do it. But he may take some steps to show himself to be more reasonable. It may also be an attempt to strike at Iranian targets in the hope that Iran won't retaliate, because of the argument that Iran would want to wait to see Trump leave office, and thus they would not respond so as to vote. So some could look at it from this perspective, that the Israeli regime wants to be provocative to see how much it can get away with. But I don't really know. I don't know what goes on in the mind of Netanyahu, because Netanyahu over the last few years has been, his fundamental concern has been staying out of prison.
We often hear this argument that perhaps Israel is, or Netanyahu at least, is trying to get away with as much as possible before Trump's tenure is over and he leaves office next month in January. But I feel like people forget that during the Obama years, when Biden was vice president, you had 4 Iranian scientists assassinated by the Mossad with U.S. knowledge, and the Stuxnet virus. We're always hawkish towards the Middle East, towards Iran.
Well, you raise a very important point, and that is that under Obama and by extension Biden, the Israeli regime murdered 4 Iranian scientists on separate occasions. And all of these attacks and all of these murders were carried out with American logistical support. The Israeli regime does not have the capability to carry out operations in Iran. The United States has embassies in neighboring countries. They have military bases all around Iran, and they are funding the MEK terrorist organization, which has offices across Europe and North America, and their main military camp is in Albania. So the Israeli regime is using the logistical support this terrorist organization that's at the disposal of the US government and by extension, again, the Israeli regime. So what happened during Obama has happened again during Trump. There's no main real difference. In fact, I would also add that while Trump murdered General Soleimani, the person who was key to defeating ISIS in Iraq and Syria, Obama created the dirty war in Syria with the Turkish president, the Saudi king, other oil-rich dictatorships in the region, and the Israelis, and of course the Europeans. So, or for example, Obama helped the genocide in Yemen. He destroyed Libya. So there's no real difference between the two when it comes to Iran or the region. Again, the maximum pressure campaign of Trump, he called it the brutal sanctions. But this whole notion of these sanctions that target Iran's banking sector and Iran's trading partners was initiated by Obama. He called them crippling sanctions. So while Obama wanted to cripple the Iranian people and help ruin the economy and have people die, Trump wanted to carry out what he called brutal sanctions, brutalize the Iranian people. The name is different, but the objective is the same. So there's no real difference between Biden and Obama and Trump. And we have to remember that Biden has already said that nothing will fundamentally change when he becomes president.
So, Professor, what do you think we can expect to see in terms of an Iranian response to this, diplomatically, militarily?
My belief is that the Iranians will ultimately strike the Israeli regime. It will be either a military strike or it will be carried out through intelligence services, or maybe a combination of both. But I have no doubt that there will be a response. We've already seen that Parliament has approved a decreased cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency and a decreased commitment to the nuclear deal, although there are differences between the Iranian administration and Parliament over what has been passed. But there is a general consensus that pressure has to be put on the United States. What Parliament did today was that it approved of a certain series of things that the Iranian government has to do. The Iranian government has to increase enrichment to 20%. It has to increase the number of its new centrifuges, the IR6 and IR8, and another heavy water reactor has to be built. So there's a series of things that they've demanded from the government. There are some differences between the government and Parliament about this. The government wants a bit, especially with regards to IAEA inspectors and inspections and the additional protocol. But there is a consensus that there must be more pressure on the United States and the Europeans.
I just find it very interesting that we always hear like, oh, Iran is violating the deal, but they don't tell you in the news that these are responses to, like acts of war. These are...
Iran, the only reason why Iran is not been carrying out its commitments is because the other side wasn't carrying out its commitments. After the Americans and the Europeans stopped abiding by their commitments, the Iranians waited for a full year and continued to carry out all its commitments. In my opinion, they waited for too long. And then after waiting a year, they gradually, over 5 phases, decreased their commitment, still abiding by some commitments as we speak. But yes, this is not what we hear in the Western media. Just like when this assassination, instead of calling it a terror attack, calling it an outrage, they try to explain, or talk about how it was done, what effect this has, instead of calling it for what it is.
Right. There's a real reluctance on the part of the Western media, Western governments, to call this out for what it is, a terrorist attack. And it's really indicative of their double standard. I mean, if this had happened in the West.
Exactly. And they tried to imply that he was in charge of making nuclear weapons. So even over the last few years, where Iran was implementing the nuclear deal, and as we speak, the Iranians are abiding by the additional protocol. So the International Atomic Energy Agency has a huge amount of access in Iran. So obviously Iran is not developing a nuclear weapon. It never was, but in any case, it hasn't been for the last few years. That's obvious, but they still murdered him. So obviously the murder had nothing to do with nuclear weapons. So, whatever the Israeli regime does in Lebanon, in Syria, in Palestine, in Gaza, in Iran, and elsewhere, the Western media will try to present it in a way to make it seem justifiable, no matter how outrageous the atrocity is.
Thank you so much for your time, Professor. It's always a pleasure having you on.
Dependency on one is one thing, but dependency on imported food, that would be urgently fatal for Iran, with US sanctions yet hanging. But Iran is rich in agricultural resources. How can its potential be exploited to its fullest? Watch Iran Today for answers.
Goes without saying that this assassination of Dr. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh is a clear, brazen violation of Iran's sovereignty. Just as the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani was also a clear violation of Iran's sovereignty, and also tantamount to an act of war, a declaration of war. To take a deeper look I'm joined by journalist and veteran war correspondent Elijah Manier. Thanks for joining me, Elijah.
Hello, Richard. Thank you for having me.
Elijah, I wanted to get your thoughts about the implications that this assassination has on the international stage. I believe you refer to it as entering the law of the jungle. Can you elaborate on the violations of international law?
Sure. Article 1 and 2 and 2.4 of the United Nations Security Council prevents any attack on sovereign states or any unlawful activity in a sovereign state. Also, it doesn't allow states to defend themselves without the agreement of the other state that is concerned. I will explain. So what the Israelis and the Americans have introduced repeatedly with so many countries in the Middle East, they speak about prevention of self-defense. And this prevention of self-defense, it means they envisage something could happen from a specific, they're going to attack it. This is what Israel did with the Iraqi nuclear power. This is what Israel did with the Syrian nuclear, the building that was supposed to be built for a nuclear facility. And this is what Israel is doing all the time. And the Americans are also using the same excuse. And that is fully against the law and against the international law that all the United Nations agreed just after the Second World War. And it has been developed and updated. And it is just not acceptable by any international law that Israel or any other state can go and attack and kill a civilian, a non-combatant. And even if there is of killing a military or an objective, they need to ask the permission of the country that is hosting this person. They just can't take the law in their hands and then go and attack just like that and say, we've done it. This is what they've done with the Brigadier Qasem Soleimani, and this is what they have been doing all the time, starting just very recently from the Obama administration with all the hundreds of drones attacks to Trump, and will continue it.
What are your thoughts on this new draft bill in the Medhurst, the Iranian parliament, as a response to this assassination and as a countermeasure to sanctions?
First of all, decision of the parliament to suggest a law that comes from the general opinion and the wish of most leaders today. Before the downing of the US drone over the Persian Gulf and the US threat against Iran, there were a bit of internal domestic problems in Iran where people have different point of view. So by downing the drone and then by the reaction of the Americans in killing the General Qasem Soleimani, what the Americans have managed to do, they have brought the Iranian nation as one bloc together behind the parliament, behind the leader of the revolution. And when the population understood that the US is continuing with hard sanctions, sanction almost everything, then they stood by their leaders. And today, yesterday, the parliament, the decision of the parliament was to suggest to continue the enrichment, to raise it to a higher level, to bypass the 2015 agreement because it was violated by the US first. That's very important to say it, because Iran did not violate the nuclear agreement that was signed by the 5 permanent members of the UN and plus Germany, that European did not abide by their commitment, did not honor the international law, and accepted the sanction on Trump, even if verbally they said they are against it. So now the National Security Council of Iran accepted the suggestion of the parliament, and this is going to find its way, be implemented. However, the parliament bill is very clear. It is giving an additional 2 months for Biden to be in power and then act swiftly and immediately upon entering the White House. If he doesn't do that, then this bill and Iran will increase its enrichment, but will never, ever reach the nuclear military level, because it is not interested in making the nuclear bomb. And that needs to be very clear. No international committee or inspection, there are no proof whatsoever that Iran is heading toward a nuclear military power. However, what the international community is trying to do is to put the missile program on the table, and that is against the 2015 nuclear agreement.
Right. So you don't expect the incoming Biden administration to be any less hawkish on Iran's ballistic missile program?
Well, any U.S. Administration, first and above all, the U.S. will, the Israeli will, and the Israeli wishes and Israeli objectives. And it is on top of the Israeli and the Saudi agenda to put an end to the Iranian missile. And Joe Biden will confront that, and he would want to discuss the ballistic missile and precision missiles of the Iranian program. And Iran will not accept to discuss it, because Iran never declared war on any country and is not ready to give up on the missiles that serve to defend the nation against the aggression of other countries or other states. We saw how President Trump attacked the Iranians by killing their general, who was a diplomat and an envoy to the Iraqi government, and how Iran responded with the missiles by being so precise not to kill and destroy the entire base, but to send a clear message that all your bases are under our missile. This is why Iran will never give up on the missile program and will not discuss Iran's allies unless there is a general peace in the Middle East, where also Israel will have to deliver its nuclear weapons and will have to stop its aggression and violation of the sovereignty of other states, and that is Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon.
Why Dr. Fakhrizadeh? Why do you think he was targeted specifically? Why at this time?
The operation is not an operation that took off between one day to another. There is a preparation behind it, and this preparation requires months, not only weeks. And it is obvious that they have allies on the ground. It is obvious that the intelligence services, more than one, and here I'm referring to the American and the Israelis, who work together for this attack. And it is obvious that has been a follow-up on Fakhrizadeh, knowing his movement, how he visits his parents, his parents-in-law every month, and follow him. And they also have the means to set up a car bomb and then have a hit team just attacking the convoy. So the reason why they killed Fakhrizadeh is just a simple show-off by Netanyahu, who is offering it to Mohammed bin Salman, who said previously that he wants to move the battle into Iran on the Iranian territory, and also to say that I have a long arm and I can hit objective or individual when I want. Now that's not going to change anything. Iran can do the same, but I'm sure the world reaction will not be the same. If Israel is coming to Iran, a civilian, I think any country in the world can go to Israel and do exactly the same, and that will be a simple tit for tat. Everybody is violating the international law. There is no more international law standing and holding, and everybody can do the same.
Elijah, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Regardless what one thinks, this assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was a terrorist attack. That much is clear. And if the United States and Israel are behind this, which seems extremely likely given their past actions, if these countries that pretend to be liberal democracies and subscribe to international law and international conventions and claim to be fighting terrorism and committing acts of terrorism themselves, because it favors their national or regional interests. This is outrageous. And the lack of condemnation from Western governments, the lack of widespread anger about this from the Western media is indicative of how deep this hypocrisy runs. If this had taken place in Europe or in America, if scientists were being assassinated in the West and government officials were being drone striked in the West, we'd never hear the end of it. But because it's happening to non-Westerners, they don't care.